Morning, Madam Chair, members. For the record, my name is Carlos Huereca with the Legislative Budget Office.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members. My name is Vlad Floimo, so that was correct. Thank you.
Okay, so Madam Chair, members, so today, as the Chair discussed, we're going to provide an overview of the Tax Expenditure Review Commission's annual legislative report. And so our office is tasked with providing technical assistance and professional assistance to the Commission. And so in that capacity, we're here to present on the report. And so the report itself was submitted February 16th of 2026. And so again, it covers activities of the Commission in the calendar year 2025. In addition to the report, we'll also present two evaluations that the Commission received. And those two evaluations actually consist of 3 tax expenditures, and a recommendation was acted upon by the Commission. So we'll provide those two presentations as well. As it pertains to the annual report, these are the items that we'll cover. So we'll briefly cover the definition of a tax expenditure, some brief background on the Commission itself, the contents of the report, and then an overview of those 5 evaluations that the Commission heard in 2025. And then Mr. Fleurmont will cover an overview of tax expenditure evaluation, of the landscape of tax expenditure evaluation. So the statutory definition of a tax expenditure is found in Minnesota Statutes 270C.11. And so these policies are sometimes described as spending through the tax code. You might hear these policies described as preferential treatment to a certain group or certain tax-paying entities. And so essentially these are policies written into law that the legislature has decided to forego on what would otherwise be considered potential state revenue under a structural reference tax structure. And so I would just reference members to the 2024 tax expenditure budget that's published by the Department of Revenue. That catalogs the tax expenditures that are being utilized throughout the state. And so in the 2024 report, there was 327 tax expenditures, and I believe a new iteration of that report will come out later this year, if I'm not mistaken. So, with regard to the Commission, just some background. So the Commission is asked to review the state's tax expenditures and to determine whether they're performing as intended. And so to do that, the Commission essentially provides 2 reviews, an initial review and then an evaluation. And so we'll go into more detail of what that means in a little bit. The Commission was created in 2021 and was first convened in 2022. And then every year, the Commission must provide a legislative report summarizing its activities in that calendar year. So as to those 2 reviews, the first is an initial review. And so the Commission, through the initial review, will establish an objective. And so that process has changed over time, but that's what consists of the initial review is identifying an objective, and potential metrics to measure the tax expenditure against can also be a part of that initial review. The second review is an evaluation, and there's 9 criteria that are outlined in statutes. That must be included in the evaluation. And so these pertain to issues of effectiveness, efficiency, incidence, in terms of like who pays for the tax in the end, a calculation of a revenue neutral rate and comparisons to similar policies within the state, but also across the country. And so perhaps the most notable of these these components is the 9th component, which is a recommendation to the legislature to either continue, repeal, or modify tax expenditure. Okay, and then just some context there. As I've mentioned already, the LBO provides some assistance to the Commission. The Department of Revenue provides data and analysis as well. And the LBO may contract with outside parties to conduct evaluations. Last item I'll touch on in terms of overview is just the complement of the Commission that's on the slide here. So 9 members, 4 from the House, 4 from the Senate, and then the Department of Revenue, the Commissioner of the Department of Revenue. And so these members will serve until the beginning of next session, 2027. Okay, now to the actual report. So to summarize the activities of the Commission met 3 times in 2025. And 5 evaluations were presented to the commission, which encompass 15 tax expenditures in total. And additionally, the commission did adopt procedures to formally produce recommendations to the legislature. Excuse me. And so the commission produced recommendations in January of 2026. And so those recommendations will actually formally be included in next year's annual report, but we'll just discuss them today. Okay, so the report itself provides an overview of the commission, just in more detail to what I just provided. Also, a more thorough summary of each meeting, and again, an overview of the tax expenditure evaluation landscape. And so again, Mr. Fleurimond will provide that overview to supplement the presentation here. And then in the appendices, you'll find that the report does include those 5 tax expenditure evaluations in full. So apologies, it's a large report, but that's largely why. Okay, so I'll also mention those 15 tax expenditures. There's a list included at the end of these, at the appendices of these slides. So if folks want to reference those 15 tax expenditures, they're in the slide deck. So those 5 tax expenditures that were presented to the commission include a standalone evaluation of the marriage credit. So we'll cover that in a little bit. And then an evaluation of 2 sales tax exemptions, which pertain to solar energy systems and wind energy conversion systems. So those are 2 separate evaluations that were bundled into one. Sorry, 2 separate tax exemptions that were bundled into one evaluation. The third evaluation is another bundle of 3 credits to small alcohol producers. So 1 for small brewers, 1 for small wineries, and 1 for micro distilleries. The fourth evaluation was a bundle of 6 lawful gambling tax expenditures. And the fifth evaluation was a bundle of 3 exemptions from the sales and use tax, which applied to residential heating fuels, residential water services, and sewer services. Okay, and so in this presentation, we have an overview of those 5 evaluations. I'm going to skip over the slides of the marriage credit and the solar energy systems, and we'll provide a fuller presentation on those. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip over these next several slides. And so I'll stop at this slide. The marriage credit, the wind energy conversion systems, and the solar energy systems are those that did receive a recommendation. And so in all 3 cases, the commission voted to modify those policies. So because they'll be included in next year's report, there will be more detail forthcoming that can summarize the recommendation, but also member discussion that took place. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Fleurimond, to cover the alcohol bundle, an overview of that, and further.
So thank you. For the record, again, my name is Vlad Fleurimond, and I'm an economist with the LBO. As my colleague just mentioned, I will provide a high-level overview of 3 tax expenditures that the LBO presented to Turk in 2025. And second, I will provide a high-level overview of the landscape of tax expenditure evaluations. So the Turk presented an evaluation on 3 tax credits for smaller alcohol producers in Minnesota, specifically for small brewers, micro distilleries, and wineries. So those 3 tax credits, they share the same objective statement, which is to promote the development and survivorship of small brewers, micro distilleries, and wineries in Minnesota. So the credit for small brewers was enacted in 1985. The credit for small winery was enacted in 2017. And the credit for micro distillery was enacted in 2014. So collectively, the Minnesota Department of Revenue estimated the total amount of foregone revenue of those 3 tax credits to be $2.4 million in fiscal year 2026. So to evaluate the 3 objective statements in the previous slide, so the LBO relies on a multitude of data sets, such as data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The LBO relies on licensure data from the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, The LBO relies on licensure data from other states, as well as a small survey that the LBO administered to smaller alcohol producers in Minnesota. So looking at the evidence overall, the LBO concluded that those 3 tax credits likely contribute to the development and survivorship of small alcohol producers in Minnesota, but the extent to which that they do so remain undetermined. And as a reminder, as my colleague just mentioned, the commission has not yet made a recommendation on this evaluation. Next, the LBO also presented an evaluation related to gambling. It's to 6 tax exemptions, so 4 of those are exclusions and 1 is a tax exemption. So the 4 exclusions and the 1 exemption, so they share the same objective statement, which is to simplify compliance with and enforcement of lawful gambling and reduce administrative burden. And there was another one, which is a credit for certain WIFOs. So that has a different objective statement, which is to use the proceeds to fight poverty, homelessness, and disability. So the 5 of those 6 tax expenditures were enacted between 1984 and 1986, and the credit for certain WIFOs was enacted in 2000. So collectively, the Minnesota Department of Revenue estimated the total amount of foregone revenue of these 6 tax expenditures to be $3.5 million in fiscal year 2026. And again, to evaluate the objective statement of those 6 tax expenditures, so the LBO relies on materials from nonpartisan legal research. The LBO relies on the annual report of the Gambling Control Board, and the LBO also conducted and interviewed with folks at the Gambling Control Board. And also the LBO relies on data from the UR, so summary data and tax data from the UR. So overall, the LBO found that those 4 gambling tax exclusions and 1 gambling tax exemption likely meet their objective of simplifying compliance with and enforcement of lawful gambling and also reduce administrative burden. And the credit for certain WIFO, which has another objective statement, so the LBO concluded that that credit likely meets its stated objective based on the requirements to receive the credit or to claim it, as all net proceeds must be used exclusively to fight poverty, homelessness, physical and mental disability. And again, as a reminder, the commission has not yet made a recommendation on this evaluation. Next, the LBO also presented a tax evaluation related to heating fuels and utility services. So those are 3 exemptions which share the same objective statement, which is to reduce tax burden for low-income households. And the tax exemption for residential heating fuel was enacted in 1978, later expanded in 1984 to include hot water. And then the tax exemption for residential water services was enacted in 1979. And collectively, the Minnesota Department of Revenue estimated the amount of foregone revenue of these 3 tax expenditures to be $344 million in fiscal year 2026. So that's a relatively big number, so $344 million. So to evaluate those 3 tax expenditures, so the LBO relied on the 2024 tax incidence report from the Minnesota Department of Revenue, and the LBO also relies on income summary and tax data from the UR. So overall, the LBO found that these 3 tax credits reduce the regressivity of sales tax and use tax, therefore alleviating tax burden on low-income households. Household making less than $25,000 save on average about $68, and household making above $127,000 save on average $183 on those 3 tax credits. Again, as a reminder, so the commission has not yet made a recommendation on this evaluation. And now, Madam Chairs and members, so having highlighted those three tax expenditures, so with your permission, I will take a brief pause just in case anyone has any questions before I continue.
Oh, Representative Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was just going to ask if we were going to hold questions till later. But I have a question about the heating fields and utility service evaluation findings. So right where we are, can you, I think I heard you say that this expenditure was enacted in 1979. Is that the right year?
Yes.
Mr. Fleurimond.
Yes, Madam Chair and members, yes, so those are three tax exemptions. So one was the heating fuel was enacted in 1978 and later expanded in 1984 to include hot water. And then the one for water services was enacted in 1979.
Representative Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just want to better understand these three expenditures and wanted you to explain maybe the fourth bullet you had that, you know, on average, these households making less than $25,000 saved $68, while it is, looks like almost 3 times as much for families making 3 times as much. So is that just proportional, or can you explain that?
Mr. Fleurimond.
Yes, Madam Chair, members, yes, so for that tax expenditure, so we work with the Minnesota Department of Revenue, where they were able to do a simulation for us. So if you were to repeal, for example, those three tax expenditures, so what would happen? And then they give us the data by income deciles. So for example, so household making less than $25,000 would save $68. And household making above $127,000 would save on average $183. So, for example, we say that that tax credit reduces regressivity because the $68 is a higher share for lower income households than the $183 for higher income households.
Representative Lee.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, to me, it seems like there is kind of some uniformity, right? Like if you make 3 times as much, it seems like, you know, your savings is 3 times as much. But I'm curious if, you know, if there's insight, and I don't know if this is a question more for some of our nonpartisan staff here, you know, in the late 80s, or it seems like early 80s, late 70s, you know, when we were enacting these expenditures, like, is this the kind of uniformity that, you know, the legislature was intending?
I'm not sure who wants to take a shot at that, if anybody.
Yeah, Madam Chair, members, I don't know that we would have the answer to that. You know, as part of the initial review, we do look at, as much as we can, the legislative record. I don't know that we've noted anything to that particular question. We could take a look at it if you'd like and try and get back to you on that, but we wouldn't know that right now.
Okay.
Thank you. Representative Lee.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Yeah, would love for the answer if someone could research more. Yeah.
Excellent. Representative Wiener.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is similar to Representative Lee's. The number on the surface here seems to indicate some things, but without all of the information, and I guess that's what I would be looking for, is number of people in the household. Is there a breakdown of rural versus urban? Are we comparing the 7-county metro versus outstate? How are those numbers derived? When we just compare household and the savings per each, yes, it looks skewed, but without all of the information, how do we make an accurate estimate of what's going on? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Wiener. Mr. Huerta.
Yeah, Madam Chair and members, as part of the follow-up from the commission, we did provide a regional breakdown of specific to Xcel Energy. They provided a breakdown of median utilization for electricity and gas customers. That was only specific to Xcel, but we can provide that follow-up information as well.
Thank you. Anything further, Representative Wiener? Thank you. Oh, so we're going to move on to like another, the landscape, right? So I guess I just have a couple of comments or that I found interesting. So just going back to it is in the alcohol bundle evaluation findings. It just occurred to me because there's this final bullet point. The pages aren't numbered, but it's in the findings. the estimated amount of tax revenue foregone by the state is more than the estimated economic impact attributed to the tax credits. So that's, to me, like, that stood out because it's a very clear, kind of statement about the return on investment of public dollars that we get, and in terms of economic output. And then, like, so it just kind of points back to the importance, I think, of the objective statements, because when you talk about, like, the objective statement here being promoting development and survivorship, that's maybe something that is easier to measure potentially than, like simplifying compliance and reducing administrative burden as something that we're trying to do through the tax code. I just think that it kind of highlights just some of the ways that we should be thinking about these investments of public dollars. So that's one thing. And so, as we're thinking about how to structure these evaluations, because we are still in a place where we have influence on it, I just want us all to remember this sort of very clear statement about return on investment of public dollars that we have with, this evaluation of the alcohol bundle, for example. The other thing that I would say that I found interesting was in the heating fuels and utility services. So one of the objective statement is about lessening the effective tax burden of low-income households and reducing the regressivity of the sales and use tax. And as we all know from the tax incidence study, the sales tax is just inherently the most regressive tax that we have. And so, of course, any kind of an intervention like this where, a family making $25K gets $68 and a household making 5 times that saves 3 times as much money, that will just inherently increase the progressivity of what is a deeply regressive tax. But I think that the other thing that we need to think about as policymakers is to say, if we were looking to lessen the, well, right, I mean, lessen the effective tax burden of lower income households, reduce the regressivity of the sales and use tax, and I would add, make sure that families can heat their homes, right? Like, or something like that. Is this the way that we would spend $344 million a year, $700 million a biennium? Is this the tool that we would use if we were intentionally designing a tax intervention to achieve these outcomes? Because that's a lot of money. What could you do with $700 million to help low-income families across the state heat their homes? Well, if you looked at LIHEAP, for example, which I'm not an expert on or anything, but if you looked at, really targeted interventions for low-income households, those people making $125K probably wouldn't get the $168 benefit, but maybe you would get closer to achieving the goal. So I apologize for going on. I get excited about tax expenditures, but there's a lot of really interesting things, and I'm going to say it again, but, this, even just in seeing this presentation so far, and the thoroughness of this report that you sent to the legislature, it just really speaks to the quality of the work and the amount of just, incredibly good and important public policy work that the Legislative Budget Office puts into this process. And I just speak for the entire committee and say that we're very grateful to you for just the thoroughness and the dedication to this sort of like niche thing, but it's very important. So thank you. Sorry, I'll keep my comments. I'll stop editorializing now. Please, Mr. Fleurimont.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So now with respect to the landscape of tax expenditure evaluations, so the rationale for including these 11 pages into the report is that at the LBO we are relatively new to the process of conducting tax expenditure evaluations. So we wanted to survey how other entities are evaluating the tax expenditure so that we can leverage best practices to improve our work on behalf of the Commission. So, and then by other entities, I mean entities at the federal level in the U.S., or at the state level in the US or at the international level with respect to other countries. So with that said, I will briefly talk about tax expenditure evaluations at the federal level in the US, the state level, international level, and I will conclude with our own practices at the LBO. So first, the federal level in the US. So as you all know, there are hundreds of tax expenditure evaluations. Just to cite a couple of them, there are federal tax expenditures related to mortgage interest deduction, various tax expenditures related to retirement accounts, charitable contributions, student loans, you name it. Also, one interrogation that someone might have about those federal tax expenditures is how do they evaluate them? So how do they know, for example, that they work, etc. And so at the federal level, there is not a federal entity or agency that's responsible to conduct tax expenditure evaluations, but the Congressional Research Service periodically publishes a compendium of federal tax expenditures for the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. So the Congressional Research Service provides a balanced assessment of the federal tax expenditures based on research papers and studies by independent economists and researchers. So the goal of the LBO in the coming months and years is to look at some of the techniques and approaches that they use in those studies so that we can improve our work on behalf of the Commission. And then next, we look at evaluation practices at the international level. Some countries use tax expenditures. So tax expenditures, according to the International Monetary Fund, are ubiquitous and often sizable. They are estimated to reduce tax revenues by an average of 4% of GDP among countries that report on them. So countries have a needs to evaluate their tax expenditures. So to assist countries in this task, international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, so they have provided guidelines and detailed guidelines for how countries should conduct tax expenditure evaluations. So again, in the coming months and years, so the task of the LBO is to look at some key lessons that we can learn from those guidelines to improve our work on behalf of Turk. Third, we look at tax expenditure evaluation practices at the state level in the US. At least 26 states have laws in the books mandating tax expenditure evaluations. And tax expenditures reduce state revenues by more than $1 trillion in 2021. So that's a lot of money. So states have a need again to evaluate tax expenditures. And to assist them in this task, so different states have different institutional arrangements. So in some states, the legislative offices are responsible to conduct tax expenditure evaluations. In some other states, that falls under the purview of the Department of Revenues. A state of like Georgia, which we work with on an evaluation of a data center, so they have an interesting arrangement where tax expenditure evaluations are the responsibilities of 3 state universities. And then some other states, for example, have contracted outside entities to evaluate their tax expenditures. So when we looked at practices from other states, so 2 key tools that they use are REMI and Implan. So those are software packages that are useful, for example, to evaluate tax expenditures that have to do with tax expenditures, let's say, whose objectives have to do with creating jobs. So those tools can be useful in looking at, for example, the number of jobs created by a certain tax expenditure. And finally, we look at our own practices at the LBO. So one question that we ask is, how do we compare with other states in the work that we're doing? Like other states, we face data challenges. As mentioned, for example, some of those tax expenditures were enacted back in the days in 1978 for the heating fuel. So sometimes it's very difficult to get data that goes that far back. But overall, our approaches at the LBO broadly similar to what other states are doing, and we intend to incorporate some of those lessons that we learn from looking at evaluation practices from other institutions. So that was a high-level review of tax expenditure evaluations from other entities. And so with that said, Madam Chair and members, I just want to express a note of appreciation on behalf of the LBO to our non-partisan colleagues in the House and Fiscal Services, as well as the Tax Research Division at the Department of Revenue, for the tremendous help that they have provided to our offices in support of the work that Turk is doing. So thank you, and we are happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fleurimont, Mr. Wedek. Are there any questions before we move to the next part of the presentation? All right, not seeing any. Thank you so much. And it's truly a group effort, as we know, so obviously a lot of work by our nonpartisan staff and the Tax Budget Research Office at the Department of Revenue also went into this. So thank you so much.